My name is Lorraine Whitmore, and while I was battling stage 3 breast cancer, my husband was in Paris, whining and dining a woman who wore lipstick I'd never seen before. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment that flipped my world, but not the way you'd expect. It was a Wednesday morning, sometime in April. I remember because the daffodils outside my kitchen window had just bloomed bright and defiant against the still, chilly air. I'd always loved them for that, their insistence to bloom when the world still hesitated. That morning, I found a lump, not a dramatic discovery, not pain or blood or anything cinematic. Just a lump slightly firmer than the surrounding tissue tucked under the curve of my left breast. I was drying off after a shower when my fingers grazed it. I stood frozen towel around my torso, palm pressed against the spot. I held my breath. Then I pressed again. Still there. My husband Martin was downstairs as always, glued to his phone and coffee. I didn't say anything right away. Not out of fear, but instinct. Something in me whispered, "Don't show your cards just yet." I dressed, made breakfast, and kissed his cheek like everything was normal. Because in our marriage, appearances were everything. Martin was a retired financial consultant, charming in public, precise to a fault, and obsessed with control. Our friends thought he was the pillar of our social circle. So reliable, they'd say. A rock. But they didn't see how his love was measured in quarters. How his compliments came only when I looked like I stepped out of a catalog. How I could feel lonelier sitting next to him at dinner than I did walking alone in the woods. At the clinic, the mammogram confirmed what I feared. The ultrasound made it real. Then the biopsy made it war. When the doctor said the word cancer, I didn't cry. I just nodded. The way women like me do. Women who've endured husbands who speak in tax brackets and silences. Women who've buried parents, miscarriages, and dreams without breaking down in public. I drove home in a kind of fog. Not panic. Just calculation. I thought of what would come next. Surgeries, chemo, the appointments. But more than that, I thought, will Martin show up for me? And I already knew the answer. That night, I sat him down. I told him I had cancer. He didn't flinch. "Do they think it's treatable?" he asked, pouring himself another glass of Merlot. "Yes," I said. "With time." He nodded. "That's good. You're strong. You'll handle it." And then he got up, walked to his laptop, and opened an email about some finance seminar in Switzerland. I watched him from across the room, and in that moment I understood something I had ignored for decades. Martin was the kind of man who loved well-packaged lives, not the mess that came with real pain. The first few weeks of treatment were brutal. The steroids bloated my face. The nausea came in waves, and the fatigue was bone deep. I'd never felt so detached from my own body. But worse than the physical toll was the emotional absence in my home. He didn't come to the appointments, didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't even Google the side effects. Instead, he traveled. A lot. Work trips, he called them, though he'd been retired for 3 years. He flew to Boston, then London, then Geneva. Always with vague explanations and receipts that didn't match. One night, while lying awake in bed, head wrapped in a scarf, chest sore from a recent port insertion, I reached for his laptop. Not to snoop, but because I needed to book my next oncology visit and my phone was dead. I opened the browser, and there it was. A travel itinerary from 2 weeks ago. Martin Whitmore. Passenger. Paris. First class. Round trip. 1 extra seat booked. The name next to his on the itinerary was Danielle Marchand. That was when my fingers went cold. Danielle Marchand was not a colleague, not a business partner. She was a 28-year-old wellness coach who had posted Instagram selfies in the same Paris hotel Martin had charged to our joint account. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I closed the laptop, folded the scarf tighter around my head, and turned off the bedside lamp. He came home 2 days later with macarons from La Durée. I didn't touch them. I also didn't touch the subject yet. Because something deeper than rage had begun to form in me. Not grief, not revenge, something more dangerous. Clarity. You see, when your body is fighting to live and the man you've loved for 40 years chooses to chase youth and fantasy instead of standing by you, something dies. But something else is born. A woman you never thought you could become. And I was about to introduce her to Martin Whitmore. The woman who used to cry in the bathroom, who used to wait for the phone to ring, who used to beg for attention, that woman was gone. In her place stood someone sharper, someone watching, someone counting. I became very good at silence. It's a powerful thing, silence. It makes people feel safe. It tricks them into thinking they're unseen. And people are always most careless when they think no one's paying attention. Martin kept traveling. He started leaving earlier, returning later. He bought colognes I didn't recognize, started dressing more European, like he was trying to shave 20 years off his image. He even got a new phone case, sleek, modern, something a millennial might use. And I just kept watching. I pretended to rest more. I pretended the chemo made me too groggy to care. He seemed relieved by that. He even had the audacity to say, "I'm glad you're finally taking it easy." What he didn't know was that every time he left the house, I logged into our joint accounts. I printed statements. I downloaded every digital receipt. I copied every travel itinerary and flagged every recurring payment to someone named D.M. Danielle Marchand wasn't just a fling, she was an expense. It was around this time that I began seeing a therapist, not for my mental health, but for legal documentation. She helped me organize every sign of abandonment, neglect, and emotional cruelty. I wasn't just surviving cancer, I was building a case. And every Tuesday at 10 a.m., I laid down facts like bricks in a wall that would eventually surround him. The house we lived in was mine, technically. My parents had left it to me, but we had refinanced it together years ago. The deed was murky intentionally, so Martin had always liked shared leverage, as he called it. But I knew now that leverage could swing both ways. One day, in the middle of my 4th chemo cycle, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and saw someone new. My skin was gray, my hair was gone, my mouth was dry from medication. But my eyes were alive, awake, dangerous. That was the day I called Miriam Caldwell. Miriam wasn't a typical divorce attorney. She was a former prosecutor who specialized in high-net-worth dissolutions involving infidelity and elder neglect. Her office had no flowers, no warm lighting, just leather glass and vengeance. She listened to my story with a neutral face, took notes, asked precise questions. At the end of our meeting, she said, "You're not trying to win him back. You're trying to strip him of everything he built with your silence." I nodded. "Then let's start with the assets," she said. "Does he know you're here?" "No," I answered. "And he won't until it's too late." We worked quietly for weeks. Miriam hired a forensic accountant. I passed along every document I'd gathered, his Paris charges, the cash transfers, even an invoice for a luxury retreat labeled romantic renewal. Couples experience. I was being poisoned with chemo while he was getting hot stone massages. Let that image burn. One afternoon, Martin returned from yet another trip. I could smell the airport lounge on him, leather scotch, the faint musk of too many colognes rubbed off on necks that weren't mine. He tossed his bag onto the bench by the stairs, kissed my forehead like a chore, and said, "You're doing so well, Lorraine. Strongest woman I know." I looked at him and said, "I made soup." He smiled, oblivious. I watched him eat it. Watched him lean back in the chair he didn't know would soon be sold. Watched him praise me for being such a survivor, not realizing I wasn't surviving, I was hunting. It was around this time that Danielle messaged me. Yes, messaged me. On Facebook of all places. It was short. Too short. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this." I thought he was separated. There was no punctuation. No real emotion, just the kind of pitiful half-confession people send to feel better about themselves. I didn't reply. Instead, I printed it. Miriam smiled when she saw it. "That's your emotional corroboration," she said. "It'll go nicely with the bank statements." 3 weeks later, I served Martin the papers. He was mid-bite into a tuna sandwich when the courier rang the doorbell. He opened the envelope in front of me, always the dramatist. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked up at me like he didn't recognize me. And he didn't. He said, "You're seriously doing this?" "While you're sick." I said, "I'm not dying, Martin. I'm healing. Just not into you." He stepped back, flinched, like he finally understood what I had become. "You'll ruin me," he whispered. "No," I said. "You did that yourself. I'm just signing off on it." Then I walked upstairs and took the longest nap I'd had in months. Downstairs, the silence was glorious, like justice getting ready to bloom. Martin moved into the guest room that night. It was the first time in over 40 years that he slept under the same roof as me, without touching me physically or emotionally. And yet, somehow, I had never felt more in control. His presence no longer loomed. It shrank. Every step he took around the house sounded like the creak of a man walking toward his own funeral. I woke early the next morning, the pale blue of dawn casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of our bedroom. My bedroom now. I moved quietly to the kitchen and made coffee. Not for both of us, just for me. For the first time in decades, I only had to think about what I wanted. The house was silent when I opened my laptop and began reviewing the affidavit Miriam's team had drafted. It was surgical in its structure: dates, amounts, psychological notes from my therapist receipts, and the message from Danielle. It was a paper trail so pristine it could carve through court like a scalpel. Martin came in an hour later dressed in one of his respectable outfits: gray wool pants, white Oxford shirt, navy cardigan, no tie. The outfit he wore when he wanted to be seen as the reasonable one in public disputes. He cleared his throat. I kept typing. Finally, he said, "I think we should talk." "No," I said calmly, still not looking at him. "You think you should talk? I think I've listened enough." He sat down anyway. "Lorraine, this isn't necessary. We can fix this." I made a mistake. "Which one?" I asked. "The younger woman, the stolen money, or abandoning me during chemotherapy?" He winced. "You don't understand," he began. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice sharp as glass. "I understand you didn't want to be married to someone sick. You didn't want the story of your life to be about the husband of a cancer patient. You wanted something shinier, something that didn't remind you of death." He didn't deny it. He just sighed. "I panicked," he said. "I was afraid I'd lose you, so I distanced myself." "You didn't distance yourself," I replied. "You defected." He tried to look wounded. I didn't give him the satisfaction. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the house changed. No more false kindness. No more performances. Just silence, footfalls, and legal updates whispered over the phone with Miriam. It turned out Martin had been transferring small sums into a personal account for months, likely to cover his luxury affairs with Danielle. But the forensic accountant had found them all. Every single one. What he thought were clever moves were actually breadcrumbs leading to a courtroom ambush. 2 weeks later, we filed for a temporary freeze on assets. Miriam's paralegal called me just after noon to say the judge approved it. I hung up, opened the drawer next to the fridge, and removed Martin's Platinum Amex card. I snapped it in too. When he came home that night, he tossed his keys on the counter, opened the fridge, and frowned. "No wine?" he asked. "No credit," I answered. His face twisted. "That card declined at the pharmacy," he said. "I had to use my debit." I shrugged. "Sounds like a personal problem." The next morning, I changed the locks on our shared online accounts. The joint cloud folder where he stored all our tax files. Downloaded and removed. The shared Netflix password. Gone. Spotify. Mine. He complained to a friend on the phone that afternoon, forgot to shut the door to his temporary guest room. I listened from the hallway. "She's turning into someone else," he said. Colder. Calculated. That made me smile. Because he was right. Cancer changed me, but so did betrayal. The combination of the two didn't break me. It rebuilt me. Stronger, smarter, with sharper edges. One evening, I received an envelope from Miriam. Inside was a hard copy of the pre-divorce asset filing. I laid it on the kitchen island and waited for Martin to come in. He did at exactly 6:42 p.m., just like always. Habit was his religion. I pushed the document across the marble countertop toward him. "What's this?" "Your blueprint for destruction," I said. He scanned the first few lines and turned pale. "Lorraine, this says you're pursuing full property control. The house, the retirement accounts. You're bleeding me dry." "No," I said softly. "You're bleeding. I'm just holding the mirror." He slammed his hand on the counter. "I gave you the best years of my life." I stood and leaned in. "And I gave you all of mine, even the ones you didn't deserve." He said nothing. He left the kitchen without another word. Later that night, I heard him crying in the shower. But I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. Because I'd already buried the woman who would have forgiven him. And the woman who rose from her ashes. She wasn't in the business of pity. The court hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning. By then, Martin had already moved out, though not by force. He couldn't stand the atmosphere anymore, he said. Claimed the house felt hostile. I told him that maybe it wasn't the house. Maybe it was the weight of truth finally pressing in. He packed 2 suitcases, kissed the air beside my cheek, and muttered, "I hope this isn't forever." I didn't respond. I just watched as the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him on the outside of everything he once took for granted. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing not just legally, but emotionally. Miriam guided me through each detail of the hearing. She was exacting and fierce, the kind of woman who wore heels like weapons and could eviscerate a witness with a smile. I trusted her completely. "You won't need to speak much," she told me. "We'll let the documents speak for themselves. But when they ask you what you want, say it plainly. Don't be gracious. Don't be vague. Say exactly what you deserve." I nodded. "But Lorraine," she added, "when this is over, don't go back to being quiet. You're not the same woman anymore. Don't pretend to be." I didn't intend to. On the day of the hearing, I wore a navy blue dress that used to be too tight on me. Now, thanks to chemo and pain and all the hunger I'd swallowed over the years, it hung just right. My hair, still growing back in soft white wisps, was tucked behind my ears. No makeup, no jewelry, just the raw, unvarnished face of a woman who had survived everything and decided to build something with the wreckage. Martin arrived 10 minutes late. He looked weathered. His shirt was wrinkled at the collar, his eyes sunken in. I noticed a small stain on the edge of his cuff, coffee probably. Or wine, maybe guilt. He tried to make eye contact. I didn't blink. The judge entered and the proceedings began. Miriam laid it all out in the opening statement. The medical timeline, the travel records, the misappropriated funds, the emotional abandonment and the betrayal during a terminal diagnosis. Then came the exhibits. Photos, emails, receipts. Danielle's message. Financial statements with unexplained cash withdrawals. The spa invoice. The romantic renewal couple's retreat with Martin's name on the booking, and a line marked champagne add-on for partner. Martin's attorney fumbled. He stammered something about emotional duress, about how Martin had been acting out of fear and struggling with anticipatory grief. The judge raised one eyebrow. "Did he attend a single medical appointment?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," Miriam replied without even looking at her notes. "Was he present for her surgeries? Her chemotherapy?" "No, Your Honor." "Did he provide financial or emotional support during her recovery?" "No. In fact, we have evidence he spent over $34,000 during her treatment window on international travel and luxury services for another woman." The courtroom went still. Martin's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Martin himself looked like a deflated balloon, his puffed-up ego slowly leaking in front of strangers. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood. "My body was fighting for life while he flew across the ocean to chase youth," I said. "I didn't ask for pity. I asked for presence. And when he chose absence, I chose clarity. I want what I'm owed, not because I want revenge, but because I want justice to have my name on it." Silence followed. Even Martin looked away. The judge ruled in my favor on every count. The house, the retirement accounts, a portion of Martin's private investment returns. He was also ordered to cover my legal fees and issue a formal written apology, though truthfully, I didn't care if he meant it. After the hearing, Martin approached me outside the courthouse. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 hours. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. "You were the best thing I ever had." I looked him in the eye and replied, "That's why you lost me." He reached out to touch my hand. I stepped back. "No more half-hearted gestures, Martini. You gave everything to someone who wouldn't even show up for you in court. You'll have to live with that." He nodded slowly. And for the first time in all our years together, he looked small. Not because I had made him so, but because he finally saw himself clearly. I walked away. Not fast. Not angry. Just done. Each step felt like the click of a lock turning behind me, one door closing after another, until all that was left was freedom. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, sunlight spilling across the marble. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of someone else's silence. I sat in mine. But this time it wasn't lonely. It was powerful. And it was mine. 3 weeks passed before Martin's name stopped appearing on my caller ID. At first it was daily, then every few days. Each voicemail was some variation of contrition. I miss you. I made a mistake. We can still fix this. The kind of pleas a man makes when he realizes no one is picking up his dry cleaning. No one is refilling the wine rack. No one is there to forgive him for being small. I never responded. It wasn't that I didn't hear him. It was that I finally heard myself louder. The peace of living alone, truly alone, was extraordinary. No more passive-aggressive sighs in the hallway. No more tiptoeing around moods. No more dinners that felt like silent interviews. Just me, my breathing, my books, and the slow but steady return of my body. The chemo ended in July. I rang the bell in the hospital corridor while nurses clapped politely. Martin wasn't there, of course, but neither was the ache of that fact. Instead, my friend Joni drove me home. She was a widow, 12 years single, with a laugh like cracked ice and the ability to make tragedy sound like gossip. She brought sandwiches and fresh flowers and sat on my porch while we talked about everything but him. "You look 10 years younger," she said, sipping lemonade. "That's because I dropped 190 pounds of dead emotional weight," I replied. We laughed. And I realized I wasn't rebuilding. I was starting over. 1 week later, I received an email. It was from Danielle. Not another apology, not even an explanation, just 2 lines. He told me everything. "I'm sorry again. You're braver than I'll ever be." There was a file attached. I hesitated, hovered my finger above the trackpad, then clicked. It was a screenshot of a text from Martin. "She took everything. The house, the accounts, even my goddamn wine subscription. I hope you're happy now. She ruined me." Danielle's message came beneath it. "He still doesn't get it, does he?" No, he didn't. And maybe he never would. But I had. For the next few months, I lived with intention. Every corner of the house was mine to redesign. I moved the furniture, got rid of the sterile gray he always preferred, repainted the walls a soft sage, planted lavender by the kitchen window. I reclaimed my wardrobe, traded the beige sweaters and pencil skirts for flowing dresses, silk scarves, and sandals with no heels. I stopped brushing my hair the way he liked. I let it curl and coil like it wanted. Like I wanted. And then, one quiet morning, I found something. It was tucked in a folder at the back of the closet. The old one, the one Martin never used. Inside was a bundle of my old poems. From my college days. Back when I taught English Lit, when words were everything. I hadn't seen them in years. And yet, as I read them, something inside me opened. Something I thought chemo and betrayal had burned away. My voice. I began writing again. At first, just notes in the margins of old books. Then whole paragraphs. Then scenes. By autumn, I had drafted the first chapter of a memoir. While I healed, he ran. It was raw, honest, and completely mine. I didn't write to hurt him. I wrote to honor what survived him. One evening in October, I submitted it to a small independent press in Vermont. A friend of Joni's had connections. 2 weeks later, I got a call. They wanted the full manuscript. By Thanksgiving, I had a publishing deal. By Christmas, I had a title in production and a photographer scheduled for the jacket cover. Meanwhile, Martin's life unraveled publicly. Danielle had left him unsurprisingly. I heard it from mutual friends at a charity gala I was invited to for cancer survivors. They said she moved to Austin with a yoga instructor and that Martin was back living in a rental condo teaching part-time finance courses at a local community college. I felt nothing. Not pity. Not joy. Just neutrality. The kind that comes when justice has already run its course. And then came the final insult or gift, depending on how you see it. He wrote me a letter. Handwritten. Sloppy. 4 pages. The ink smeared in places either from rushed penmanship or tears. I didn't care which. He said all the things I had once begged to hear about his regrets. His shame. His realization that I was the only person who had ever truly seen him. He asked if I'd consider talking, even as friends. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Then I locked the drawer. Because what he didn't understand and never would was this. I hadn't just left the marriage. I had left that version of myself behind, and no letter, no apology, no shared nostalgia would bring her back. The memoir launched the following spring. I didn't expect it to go viral. I thought it would maybe sell a few hundred copies, mostly to kind friends, and perhaps a few curious readers drawn in by the title. But apparently, I had underestimated how many women had been quietly abandoned. The book's full title was While I Fought Cancer, He Took His Girlfriend to Paris, a memoir of betrayal, survival, and something better. It struck a nerve. Reviewers called it quietly devastating, honest to the point of violence, and a blueprint for reclaiming dignity. Book clubs began picking it up. Women emailed me, hundreds of them. Some were caregivers who had been left behind when their loved ones no longer found them inspiring. Others were divorcees whose husbands had orchestrated their disappearances like vanishing acts. And then there were women who hadn't left yet, but now whispered, "Your story gave me the courage to begin." I didn't know what to do with that kind of impact at first. It scared me. I had spent so many years trying not to take up space, trying not to be too much. But here I was being too much and finally being heard. I was asked to speak on a podcast, then another, and then a panel at a women's rights symposium. They introduced me as Lorraine Whitmore, author, survivor, truth teller. I didn't cry. Not then. But after one interview, after I'd told the story for what felt like the 100th time, a young producer came up to me backstage. She looked no older than 25, with pink hair, a clipboard, and eyes that shimmered with something I couldn't place. "You don't know me," she said, "but my mom went through something like this. She just never told anyone. And now, she's reading your book." I've never seen her sit that still. That's when the tears came. Not loud or messy, just soft, slow, sacred. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that my pain, my wreckage, had become a lighthouse for someone else. And Martin became a footnote. I heard bits and pieces over the months. That he tried to pitch his own version of events to a podcast that declined. That he'd been quoted saying I weaponized cancer and promptly got roasted in a comment section by a swarm of readers. He even posted a blog once, anonymously accusing me of playing the victim. Someone forwarded it to me. I read every word. And then, with a calmness I didn't recognize, I closed the tab, took a sip of tea, and smiled. The truth doesn't need to scream when it knows how to endure. One evening, I walked into the local bookstore to sign a stack of paperbacks they'd requested. There on the featured table was my face, eyes, steady lips, slightly parted, a woman mid-sentence. The title wrapped around the cover like a whisper and a war cry. I flipped to the dedication. For the women who fought battles alone and came back with something louder than victory, clarity. And beneath that, I had added something just for me. And for the girl I used to be, thank you for surviving long enough to become me. That night, as I walked home from the bookstore, the sky opened up, and it rained light, cool spring rain that smelled like everything was beginning again. I didn't run for shelter. I let it soak me. My scalp, my clothes, my memories. And I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I was free. Free from waiting for someone to care. Free from the burden of second chances for men who only knew how to take. Free from the hollow silences of a marriage that had died long before I ever got sick. At home, I changed into dry clothes, curled up on the couch with a book that wasn't mine, and played a jazz record Martin always hated. It filled the room like a cathedral. I poured a glass of wine. To myself. To the past. To what's next. And just as I took the first sip, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a woman I'd never met. "I read your story. He left me when I had surgery last year. But I just filed for divorce. And I just wanted to say, thank you." I placed the phone face down and whispered to the ceiling, "You're welcome." Because sometimes the best revenge isn't public. It's private peace. And the life you build when no one's watching. There's something haunting about seeing someone who once thought they were above consequences diminished. Martin appeared again in my life, not directly, but through a coincidence. Joni texted me one evening. "Guess who I just saw at the discount pharmacy on Lincoln Ave? Your ex looking like a tax deduction?" I laughed out loud. Then she followed with a photo she sneakily snapped. Martin standing in line disheveled, holding a $6 bottle of red wine and a half-used box of tissues. I stared at the photo for a moment, not with satisfaction, not even with disdain, but with a peculiar softness, a softness reserved for people who never knew how to save themselves from themselves. His world, once pristine and controlled, had slipped through his fingers. The young girlfriend was gone. The friends he had once hosted in our lavish dining room were now ghosting him. People don't stick around long when the wine stops flowing and the show gets canceled. He still had the condo, I assumed. But the last I heard, he'd rented out the master bedroom to a grad student for passive income. The man who once scoffed at Airbnb now lived like an invisible host in his own life. And me. I was invited to speak at a literary festival. My memoir had reached its fourth reprint. A modest success by industry standards, but a monumental one for a first-time author. Especially a woman nearing 70 emerging from illness and betrayal. The night before the festival, I stood in front of the hotel mirror in a green silk blouse and pearl earrings, both gifts to myself. My hair had grown back into soft silver curls, wilder than before, freer. My reflection felt like someone I had waited a lifetime to meet. I took the stage the next morning in front of 300 strangers. They clapped when I walked up, but they stood when I finished. I talked about survival, of course, about illness and loss, but mostly I talked about silence and how women are conditioned to maintain it, decorate it, and even defend it, when what they should do is listen to what grows beneath it. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached me in tears. She took my hand and whispered, "Thank you for telling the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it." I squeezed her hand and replied, "Thank you for still listening." That evening, I took a walk through the city alone. I passed a jazz bar with a crimson neon sign that said, "Open mic tonight." I don't know what came over me, but I walked in. The room was dim, intimate. Mostly 20-somethings reading poetry or playing guitar. I signed up. When they called my name, the host smiled and said, "We've got a surprise tonight. Let's give it up for Lorraine." I took the mic. I read a poem I hadn't touched in 40 years, written before Martin, before marriage, before the world told me how small I needed to be loved. It was raw, messy, full of words that didn't always rhyme but always meant something. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then more. A standing ovation for a poem about a woman who remembered who she was before she was someone's wife. Back at my hotel that night, I opened my inbox. There was an email from Martin. Subject line, "Read your book." No greeting. No signature. Just one line. "I don't know the woman you've become, but I wish I had." For a moment, I hovered over the keyboard. Then I closed the laptop. I had no need to respond, because that was the point. He wasn't supposed to know the woman I'd become. She wasn't for him. She was for me. And she was just getting started. Spring melted into summer, and with it came a strange, quiet joy. I no longer marked days by medication schedules or court dates. I woke up when I wanted. I ate when I was hungry, not when a husband's calendar permitted dinner. I read long books gardened in bare feet and let music fill the rooms without worrying whether it would annoy anyone else. Freedom, as it turns out, wasn't loud. It was gentle. It came in the form of being able to sleep diagonally across the bed, of not having to explain a single purchase, of taking a nap in the middle of the afternoon and not feeling guilty. One morning, I received a letter, an actual letter with a stamp and postmark. It was from a woman named Sharon who lived in North Carolina. She was in her 70s and had read my memoir with her adult daughter. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, elegant cursive. She wrote about how her husband of 48 years had quietly erased her name from their family trust while she was hospitalized for pneumonia. How he'd told her coldly that since you were half dead anyway, I thought I'd simplify things. Her daughter had found my book in an airport bookstore and given it to her marked with post-its and underlines. Sharon ended the letter with, "I haven't filed yet, but I'm going to. I want to end things before my story turns into an obituary. Thank you for writing what I didn't know I needed to read." I cried when I read it. Not because I was sad, but because I understood that I had helped light a fuse. And once a woman lights that first match, she rarely puts it out. Later that week, I received a request from a television producer. She wanted to adapt the memoir. Nothing flashy, she said. Just something intimate, beautiful, painful, and empowering. A limited series. 6 episodes. You'd be involved as a consultant? I asked her, do you really think there's an audience for a story about an older woman who gets left, gets sick, and then gets even? She replied, it's the story everyone's been waiting for. They just didn't know it yet. I said yes, because why not? Why shouldn't the world see what happens when the woman they left behind writes the ending? Contracts were signed. I met the screenwriter, a lovely woman named Yara, who was 34 whip smart, and said, your story reminds me of my mom's, and my grandmother's, and every woman I know who was taught to shrink. They hired a middle-aged actress to play me. She had storm in her eyes and velvet in her voice. I liked her instantly. The series began pre-production in autumn. And Martin found out, of course. I assume someone forwarded him the press release or the magazine feature. Or maybe he just stumbled across it on social media the way ghosts sometimes haunt their old lives. I got a message from a mutual acquaintance. He's telling people you're exaggerating. I smiled, because of course he was. Men like Martin don't believe a story is real unless they're the main character. And when they're not, they dismiss it. But this wasn't his story anymore. And every time someone turned a page, every time someone watched an episode, every time a woman nodded quietly in the privacy of her living room, I was reminded that this wasn't just revenge. It was resurrection. One afternoon, I sat on my porch with a copy of the shooting script. Joni sat beside me sipping gin from a teacup because she claimed it was aesthetic. She read a scene aloud, the part where the fictional version of me delivers the line in court. You didn't just abandon me. You abandoned the version of yourself that could have loved me. And for that, I grieve you no more. Joni let out a long whistle. Damn, that's brutal. I chuckled. It's true. We clinked teacups. Across the street, a couple argued about something small, a dog leash or a dinner plan. I didn't eavesdrop. I didn't judge. But I did think about how easy it is to miss the signs. How betrayal never arrives with fanfare. How it trickles in through the cracks of convenience and comfort. And how if you're not paying attention, it can rot everything while you're still calling it love. But not anymore. Not for me. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees and cast the porch in gold, I wrote a new poem in the back of my journal. It ended like this. He left me for someone younger. I left him for someone quieter. Myself? I never expected to be recognized in a grocery store. But there I was in aisle 6 holding a jar of olives when a woman in a crisp denim jacket paused beside me. Lorraine. She asked, her voice a mixture of caution and awe. I turned, caught off guard. Yes. She smiled so wide I thought she might burst. I knew it. I read your book twice. And the audiobook, I've played it every time I needed to remember I'm not crazy. She was in her late 40s, I guessed. Hands worn, eyes heavy. But there was a fire in her. I recognized immediately the early stages of waking up. I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago, she said, lowering her voice. He didn't even see it coming. I put my hand gently on her arm. Good, I said. That's when it works best. She laughed, wiped her eye, and added, I hope you know you saved a lot of us. I didn't know what to say. It still felt strange to be seen as some kind of warrior. I hadn't set out to change lives. I just needed to tell the truth. But maybe that's exactly what makes it powerful when truth is told, not to make noise, but to clear a path. That night back home, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and reread the original manuscript. There were typos, tangents, lines I now would rewrite. But I kept them, because they weren't written from a place of polish. They were written from the edge of a woman's grief. And I needed to remember that edge. Because healing isn't linear. There were still nights when I felt the ache of what was lost. Not him exactly, but the life I thought I had. The comfort of routines. The illusion of being chosen. But those moments passed more quickly now. Especially when a few weeks later I received an invitation. It was from a women's legal advocacy group in Boston. They were holding a conference called Redefining Survival, and they wanted me to keynote. We think you've become a symbol of transformation, the letter said. I read that sentence over and over, marveling at how far language had carried me from ignored wife to symbol. At the event, I stepped onto the stage in a navy blue pantsuit, hair pinned back, a microphone clipped to my lapel. I looked out at a room of 500 women, lawyers, doctors, social workers, survivors, daughters, and I spoke. I told them what betrayal looks like in a well-decorated home, what silence tastes like when it's swallowed with dinner, what the slow erosion of identity feels like under the mask of a good marriage. But more importantly, I told them what recovery looks like, what power feels like when it's quiet, what justice sounds like when it finally calls your name. Afterward, a young woman handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. My mother left after 42 years. She read your book, then packed her things and said, "It's time I stop waiting for him to love me right." You gave me back my mother? Thank you. I pressed the paper to my chest. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a signal fire. That summer production for the series began. I visited the set once, just once, because seeing a fictionalized version of your own breakdown being lit and framed for cameras is not something one can do too often. But it was surreal. There was an actress playing me, another playing Danielle, and the man cast as Martin, tall, handsome, almost charming, stood under the bright lights and delivered the same hollow apologies I'd heard in real life. I watched from behind a monitor as the courtroom scene played out. The actress version of me stood and declared I didn't get cancer so I could be abandoned. I got cancer and discovered who was willing to disappear. I felt my heart beat faster. Those weren't just lines. They were scars spoken aloud so others could find their own. The director asked if I wanted to change anything. I shook my head. No, I said. Let her speak. The show premiered in the fall. It didn't just do well, it exploded. Streaming numbers climbed. Hashtags bloomed. Wiley fought cancer trended for 3 days straight. And Martin, he went silent, at least publicly. I heard from one of his former co-workers that he'd been seen in a bar arguing with someone about creative liberties and one-sided stories. Let him argue. Let him shout in empty rooms about being misunderstood. I didn't need to correct him. I had the truth. In hardcover, in syndication, in the hearts of women who'd already left him in their own lives. That weekend, I held a small dinner at my house, just a few friends, a bottle of champagne, and a toast that wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. As I raised my glass, I said, "To the silence we escaped, and the voices we found inside it." And for the first time, the clink of glasses didn't sound like a celebration. It sounded like a choir. In the weeks after the series aired, the world seemed to shift around me, not because I became famous, but because I became visible. People stopped me on the street. Strangers sent handwritten letters and emails with subject lines like "You told my story," or "I thought I was the only one." But the most surprising moment came when I was invited to speak at my old university. It had been decades since I'd last walked through those ivy-covered archways. I had once taught modern literature there before I gave it all up to support Martin's career. He said it would be temporary, that his travel schedule would make it too hard for both of us to work full-time. I believed him. I'd believed a lot of things, but now I was returning not as a wife, not as a professor's spouse, but as the author of a best-selling memoir that had somehow redefined what resilience looked like. The auditorium was packed: faculty, students, alumni. I stood on stage, adjusted the mic, and told them everything I had once hidden. About losing my identity in the name of love, about the loneliness of being abandoned mid-diagnosis, about the beauty of rebuilding from a silence so thick it nearly swallowed me. I ended with this: I am not angry anymore. Not because I forgave him, but because I finally forgave myself. For staying too long. For shrinking. For thinking that surviving meant being quiet. It doesn't. Surviving means saying, "This is my voice, and I will never trade it for safety again." The applause was thunderous, but the most unexpected thing happened afterward. A woman, maybe in her 80s, approached me with a cane in one hand and a worn paperback in the other. Her fingers trembled slightly as she passed me the book. Inside the front cover was a note. "For my granddaughter, in case one day she forgets what she's worth." I signed it, then hugged her, because women like her had paved the path I'd finally walked. That night, I sat alone in my hotel room, lights dimmed, feet sore from too many standing ovations. And I thought of Martin not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. He had tried to erase me, but in doing so, he had given me a blank page. And I had rewritten the whole damn book. I hadn't heard from him in months. Then one morning, the phone rang. It was an unknown number from out of state. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Lorraine." The voice was hoarse familiar. It was Martin. There was a long pause before he said, "I saw the series." I didn't reply. I just wanted to say, "It hurt." I let that sit in the air. Heavy. Real? I imagine it did, I finally said. He chuckled bitterly. "You made me a villain." "No," I replied. "You made yourself irrelevant." Silence. Then, "I'm sorry," I exhaled. Not out of relief, but because for the first time the words didn't sting. They didn't land. They just floated. "Martin," I said, "I'm not angry anymore. But I also don't need anything from you. Not an apology, not an explanation. I just need you to understand that the woman you left behind no longer exists. And the woman I am now, she doesn't wait for closure. She creates it." Click. I hung up. And just like that, the ghost was gone. Later that afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found a small padded envelope. Inside was a delicate necklace, a simple silver pendant shaped like an open book. No note. No name. Just a return address from a boutique in Paris. Danielle. I held it in my palm for a long time. Not because I forgave her, but because I knew what it cost her to send it. She had walked away too. And maybe that was enough. I placed the pendant on my dresser beside a photograph of me, bald smiling, holding a glass of wine from the day I rang the chemo bell. Proof that some beginnings wear the face of endings. Proof that you can survive even the parts of your life you thought would kill you. And not just survive, but write something beautiful with the ashes. Winter arrived like an exhale, quiet, clean, and final. The trees outside my window stood bare, their limbs stretched wide like they too were learning to hold space for emptiness without fear. I found comfort in that barrenness, in the stripped-down truth of things. I had always thought of winter as a kind of death. Now I knew better. It was just a season of waiting, a pause, the quiet before the bloom. And I was no longer afraid of the waiting. The series was nominated for an award Best Limited Series in a Human Rights category. The nomination alone was more than I'd ever dreamed, but when the producer called and said, "You should come to the ceremony," I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to sit in a room full of spotlights and strangers. But then I remembered, this story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd ever been left ignored or erased. So I said yes. I wore a charcoal satin dress and a pair of earrings I'd bought in a thrift shop for $5, the kind of earrings Martin would have called tacky. I wore them anyway. They sparkled under the lights, catching every camera flash like a private wink. The event was surreal. Red carpet, interviews, a whirlwind of praise and perfume. And then, mid-evening, a journalist asked me a question no one had asked before. "Do you ever miss him?" I didn't flinch. "No," I said, "because you can't miss someone who was never really there." She nodded slowly, the weight of my answer lingering between us like incense. When the ceremony ended, we didn't win. Another series did a beautiful one deserved. And I clapped sincerely. Winning had never been the point. Just being heard was the revolution. Back at the hotel, I stood on the balcony and looked out over the city. Somewhere below, people were stumbling into cabs and laughing with champagne on their breath. And I was there alone, yes, but not lonely. Alone had become sacred. A space no longer filled with longing or fear. A space I had fought to earn. Weeks passed. Then months. I published a second book, not a memoir, but a novel. Fiction, though heavily inspired by the women I'd met since the memoir. The publisher wanted to call it The Softest Exit, and I agreed. It was about a woman who leaves quietly but rebuilds loudly. A woman who plants justice like a garden. It sold even faster than the first. And then came something I truly hadn't expected. A call from an old student of mine, Amelia. She had been in my lit class 27 years ago. Back then, she was shy, brilliant, and unsure of her place in the world. Now she was a published poet, a mother of two, and the keynote organizer of a writing residency for women over 50. She asked if I would come, not to speak, to write, to just be. I said yes. And that June, I flew to the Pacific Northwest where I spent 4 weeks in a cabin by the sea with 10 other women, all of us strangers, all of us somehow mirrors of one another. We wrote about marriage and motherhood, about rage and reawakening, about silence and screaming. We walked barefoot along rocky shores. We built fires and read our work aloud. One night, as the sky turned indigo and the wind pushed against the cabin walls, I read a new essay I'd been working on. It wasn't polished. It didn't have a clean arc, but it was honest. When I finished, no one clapped. They just nodded, some with tears in their eyes, as if they had been waiting their whole lives for someone to say what I'd just said. Afterward, one of the women approached me. She was in her late 60s, a widow. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "I've been trying to leave my own ghost," she said. "Reading your work helps me remember that grief isn't something we escape. It's something we learn to walk beside." I hugged her, tight. And in that moment, I knew something I had never been certain of before. I wasn't here to tell the story of what was taken from me. I was here to show what I built in its place. That residency changed everything. Not because it made me more successful or more recognized, but because it returned me to something I had lost long before Martin's betrayal, before even the marriage, before the cancer, before the silence that settled like dust in every corner of my old life. It gave me back my original voice, the one that existed before I was someone's wife, before I was somebody's disappointment or obligation, the voice that wasn't filtered through politeness or fear, the voice that dared to say, "I exist, I see, I remember." I wrote daily, sometimes until the candles burned down to wax puddles and the sea wind rattled the windows like an old memory trying to get in. One essay I wrote during those weeks when the house went quiet was published in a literary journal and shared thousands of times. It wasn't about Martin. It wasn't even about cancer. It was about what silence teaches us after the chaos leaves. About how grief hums differently when you finally realize you've outlived the version of yourself who needed someone else to feel whole. When the residency ended, we all hugged and promised to stay in touch. Promises that, to my surprise, weren't empty. We still meet once a month over video. 10 women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s scattered across the country, reading each other's words aloud like sacred scripture. We call ourselves the late bloomers. And one night, in the middle of a reading, someone asked a question I hadn't been asked in a long time. "Do you think you'll ever fall in love again?" The group went silent. All eyes turned to me. I thought about it carefully, then said, "I already have. I fell in love with the sound of my own breath, with the morning light on my bookshelf, with the freedom of not having to explain why I want to be alone on a Friday night. I don't need romantic love. I have authors who don't disappoint me, friends who see me, and a life I don't have to apologize for." There were smiles. One woman whispered, "Amen." Still, I understood the question beneath the question. Do we ever get that kind of love again? The kind that holds us when we're raw and real? I didn't know. But then something unexpected happened. I met someone. Not in the romantic way, not yet at least. But he was different. His name was Elias. He was a guest speaker at the residency, a historian who gave a lecture on women erased from history. His voice was deep, steady, his eyes kind. He wore rumpled corduroy and carried a stack of dog-eared books. After his talk, we had tea by the window. He asked me about my work. I told him a little, then a little more. And he listened, not performatively, but attentively, like he was taking notes with his heart. A few days later, he mailed me a letter. Yes, mailed. Inside was a page torn from an old poetry collection by Anna Akhmatova. He'd underlined a line, "You will hear thunder and remember me, and think she wanted storms." There was no signature, just a note, for the woman who remembered how to roar. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't flutter, but I smiled, because I had never wanted the fairy tale. I had always wanted to be understood. Elias didn't try to save me. He saw I didn't need saving. He just stood still and offered presence. Sometimes that's all we really crave. A witness, not to our suffering, but to our survival. We exchanged letters for months. Still do. He lives on the coast a few hours north. We meet sometimes, walk, talk, drink, tea, share books. He never touches my scars, but he honors them. And in a world that once made me feel unlovable for being too much or not enough, that simple reverence is a kind of love I never expected to experience. One evening, I asked him if he had seen the show based on my memoir. He nodded. Of course, but it's not what made me admire you. Oh, I asked. It was the way you carry silence, he said. Like a lantern, not a burden. That night, I stood in front of my mirror, not to judge, not to adjust, just to witness. There I was, older, softer, braver, a woman no longer hiding in her own story, a woman no longer waiting to be chosen, because she already had been by herself. I didn't tell many people about Elias, not because I was ashamed or uncertain, but because some things are sacred when they're small. And after years of being someone's trophy, someone's obligation, someone's invisible backbone, I wasn't eager to be anyone's spectacle again. We weren't a headline. We weren't a second chance at love. We were two people who found each other past the noise. And we listened, in a world that kept asking me, so what's next? Book tours, speaking gigs, interviews. I found solace in the quiet weekends when he'd bring a thermos of coffee and 2 almond croissants, and we'd sit on my back porch reading aloud from separate books, but somehow sharing the same story. He never rushed me, never asked me to define us. He didn't shrink in my shadow, nor did he try to pull me into his. That, I think, was the real difference. One day, I received an invitation to return to the hospital where I'd first received my cancer diagnosis. They were hosting a panel for National Survivors Day and asked if I would share a few words with newly diagnosed patients. I hadn't stepped into that building in over 4 years. Just walking past the reception desk made my throat tighten. The smell of antiseptic, the distant beep of machines, the echoes of hushed voices. It all came back in waves. I expected to feel grief, but what I felt was distance. That woman, the one who sat in that cold exam room with a gown knotted behind her neck and fear curling in her chest, she was still part of me, but she no longer owned me. I spoke to a room of 25 patients and survivors. Some were bald. Some wore scarves like armor. Some held their partner's hands so tightly I could see their knuckles go white. I told them my story, but not the one on the show or the one in the book. I told them the truth that came after the headlines. I told them that recovery isn't linear. That healing has nothing to do with being brave every day. That some mornings I still wake up and check for bruises that aren't there. That forgiveness isn't required, but self-respect is. And I told them this. The person you were before the diagnosis, before the betrayal, before the scars, they're not gone. They're waiting on the other side. And when you meet them again, you'll realize they never needed saving. They were just waiting for permission to begin. When I finished, a young man in the back row stood and asked, "How did you find the courage to leave while you were still sick?" I smiled. "I didn't find the courage," I said. "I found the truth. And once you see it, courage follows." After the event, I sat in my car for a long while before driving home. Elias had left a message on my phone. It was just a line of poetry. She was not the fire's victim. She was the match. I listened to it 3 times. Because it was true. I wasn't the woman who had been burned by life. I was the one who set the fire. To the lies. To the silence. To the belief that I had to be small to be safe. That evening, I pulled out an old wooden box from the back of my closet. Inside were memories I hadn't touched in years. My wedding ring, faded love letters from Martin, old photos from anniversaries where I'd faked a smile. I laid them out on the kitchen table. One by one, I touched each memory with something close to affection, but distant, like watching a film you no longer feel connected to. Then I packed them into a sealed envelope, wrote "Past" in thick marker across the front, and dropped it in the fireplace. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I watched it burn. Slow, decisive, final. Later, I wrote in my journal, "I don't miss the woman I was. I mourn her, but I don't want her back. Because the woman I am now has boundaries, has fire, has stories. She doesn't beg. She doesn't perform. She doesn't stay." Autumn arrived gently, like a letter I'd forgotten I sent to myself. The days grew shorter, but the light became softer. brushing across the windows, lingering on the spines of books curling around my teacup in the quiet hours between 4 and 6 p. It was in those hours that I wrote most. Not for publishers, not for an audience, just for me. Elias visited less often during those months, not out of absence, but out of respect. He understood that solitude for me was no longer a wound to be filled. It was a choice, a kind of communion with everything I had lost and reclaimed. Still, he sent postcards, sometimes quotes, sometimes sketches, once a simple line: "Some women are oceans. You don't cross them, you surrender." I pinned that one to my fridge. The house had changed. Gone were the stiff-backed dining chairs Martin insisted on keeping because they were traditional. Gone were the heavy drapes, the cold silverware, the unused whiskey decanter that had sat like a monument to masculinity. I replaced them with mismatched chairs from estate sales curtains that caught sunlight like music, and mugs hand-thrown by local artists. Everything now was chosen, including the people I let in. One Sunday, I hosted a small gathering for the women from the residency, the late bloomers, as we still affectionately called ourselves. They came from upstate the coast, the city. We brought food, poems, secrets, and then, out of nowhere, someone asked, "Do you ever wish he could see all this?" The room went still for a beat. It was Meredith who asked. Sweet, tentative Meredith, whose own ex had spent 15 years telling her she was too sensitive to be loved. I looked around the room. My home. My sanctuary. "No," I said, because if he saw it now, he'd still find a way to dismiss it. The point isn't for him to see what he lost. The point is that I no longer care if he does. There were quiet nods, then laughter. And wine? That night, after everyone left and the dishwasher hummed its lullaby, I stepped out onto the back porch wrapped in a wool shawl. The air was sharp, fragrant with the leaves and the memory of summer. I thought about the phrase people kept using to describe me. She got everything. The house, the money, the public sympathy, the vindication, but they didn't know the price. They didn't know the long nights of chemo where my mouth tasted like metal and my body felt like ash. They didn't see the years I spent erasing myself just to keep someone else's narrative intact. They didn't hear the silence at 2 a.m. when I lay awake wondering if I would survive not the cancer, but the hollowness. They didn't see the cost of waking up, but I did, and I would pay it again. Because what I got in return wasn't everything. It was mine, my breath, my voice, my story, and the freedom to tell it without flinching. The next morning, I received an email from a publisher in the UK. They wanted to buy international rights for The Softest Exit. They were planning a European tour, bookstores in London, Edinburgh, Dublin. I stared at the email, blinking back surprise. Or maybe it wasn't surprise. Maybe it was something simpler. Readiness. I forwarded it to Elias with a one-line note. "Want to get lost in a country where no one knows who I used to be?" His reply came within an hour. "I've been waiting for you to ask." And just like that, a new chapter formed, not as an escape, but as an extension. Not a romantic whirlwind, but a gentle unfolding. No grand declarations, no promises of forever, just two people with passports and pages to fill. That evening, I began packing. Not because I was running from anything, but because for the first time in my life I was moving toward something unnamed, something mine. The train rolled through the English countryside like a thread pulling me toward the final stitch in a tapestry I never meant to weave, but somehow couldn't stop myself from finishing. It had been 6 months since the European book tour began. 6 cities, countless readings, bookstore windows displaying my name beside phrases like "the voice of resilience" or "she who refused to disappear." I spoke in packed halls and intimate corners. Listeners cried. Some brought me journals filled with their own scribbled truths. Some brought nothing at all, just the trembling urgency of someone who had never been allowed to say. This happened to me too. Elias was with me for most of it. He never hovered. He just stood quietly, always nearby, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had once left open. We had grown closer than I thought I'd allow anyone again. But there was no claiming, no possession, only presence. And that made all the difference. In Dublin, after a panel about grief and reclamation, a man approached me, early 60s, soft accent, hesitant smile. He said, "My wife. She read your book before she died. It helped her leave peacefully." Then he reached into his coat and handed me a dog-eared copy of While I Fought Cancer, with a dried four-leaf clover tucked inside the cover. "She asked me to give you this," he said. "She wanted to thank you for showing her she wasn't alone." I held that clover in my hand for a long time after he left and thought, maybe that's what legacy really is, showing people how to walk through their own fire with their heads held high. The final reading of the tour was in Paris. Poetic, really. The city that once marked betrayal now became the place where I ended the telling. We stayed in Montmartre. The mornings smelled of espresso and old stone. The nights carried jazz through open windows. On our last evening, I took a walk alone, something I hadn't done in years without looking over my shoulder or shrinking inward. I wandered into the lobby of a hotel that felt familiar. Because it was the same hotel where Martin had once stayed. The one from the itinerary I found during chemo. The concierge didn't recognize me, of course. Time has a way of changing us in all the right ways. But I knew the space instantly. The scent of lilies. The quiet hush of money. I walked up to the front desk and smiled. "I stayed here a long time ago," I said softly. "Welcome back," the clerk replied. I didn't correct her. Instead, I asked for a glass of champagne at the bar, not to celebrate the past, but to bury it properly. Elias met me at a bench overlooking the Seine that evening. I handed him a copy of my next manuscript. "A novel this time," I said. He nodded and tucked it beneath his arm like it was something precious. We sat in silence, watching the city sparkle around us. Not every ending needs dialogue. But eventually he asked, "Would you ever write about me?" I looked at him and said, "I already have. But you're not the main character." He smiled. "Good. That means you're finally writing for you." Later that night, I stood on the hotel balcony, wind tousling my hair, the sound of the river below, like breath, like forgiveness, like everything I once feared I'd never have again. And I whispered not to Martin, not to the past, not even to myself, just to the air. "I didn't just survive you. I outgrew the version of me who needed your love to feel whole. I left the story where you were the center, Heim, and wrote one where I didn't need to be rescued. Because I became the storm you thought would never come." And with that, I finally closed the book. I once believed that stories like mine ended in bitterness or in silence, that the best I could hope for after betrayal was a clean escape, maybe a quiet life with fewer regrets. I thought healing was a polite word for forgetting, that strength meant hardening, that forgiveness had to come before peace. I was wrong. What I've learned, what life taught me painfully and without apology, is that survival isn't the end of the story. It's the middle. It's the breath between collapse and creation. It's the question, now that you've burned, what will you build from the ashes? And I built this, a voice loud enough to echo past shame, a life wide enough to fit joy and sorrow without apology, a story not centered on what was done to me, but on what I chose next. If you're reading this and you're still in the silence, still waiting for someone to see you, still wondering if the story gets better, let me be the first to tell you, you don't have to wait. You don't have to be chosen. You already are enough. And if you've already left physically, emotionally, spiritually, then I raise a glass to you, to every woman who walked away, to every scar that still tingles when it rains, to every voice that whispered not anymore and meant it. Your story matters. Tell it, if not to the world, then to yourself. Write it on napkins. Whisper it in the mirror. Carve it into your future. Because no one gets to erase you. Not illness. Not betrayal. Not a man who thought you'd crumble. You are the story. And you are not done yet. Thank you for listening to Grace's Truth. Please consider sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it and tell us in the comments, what would you say if you could rewrite your story? Subscribe for more stories where silence becomes strength.